On a September evening in 2017, in a quiet corner of southwest London, neighbours noticed something wrong. Thick grey smoke rose from the back garden of a house on Wimbledon Park Road. The smell was heavy and sickening, nothing like a normal barbecue. People closed their windows, but the stench stayed in the air. Finally, someone called the fire brigade. When firefighters arrived, they found the garden gate locked and a man moving around a bonfire at the back of the house. He said he was burning rubbish and food. The flames were high, the smoke dark. As the crew worked to put the fire out, they looked more closely at what lay inside the glowing pile of ash and half-burnt debris. Among the charred pieces of wood and metal, they saw shapes that did not belong there. Bones, a hand, part of a face. They realized that they were looking at human remains. Police arrived within minutes. The man in the garden was Wissem Medouni, a French national who lived in the house with his partner and her 2 children. At first he tried to claim that the body was a sheep carcass. The explanation made no sense. The officers took him into custody and began to search the property. Inside the house, they found signs of a normal family life. Children's toys, clothes, everyday objects. Outside, in the ashes of the bonfire, they recovered jewelry, fragments of glasses, and other small items that would later help identify the victim. Within a short time, the remains were taken to a mortuary, where a pathologist began the difficult work of reconstructing what was left of the body. Even though the burns covered almost everything, enough survived for investigators to build an answer. The victim was a young woman, early 20s, slight build. She had been burned almost to nothing, yet she carried a name that her family still spoke with love back in France. Her name was Sophie Lyonnais, a 21-year-old au pair from the town of Troyes. The question for detectives was simple and enormous at the same time. Who was Sophie? How had she ended up in this house in London, and what had happened to turn a job caring for children into a path that led to a bonfire in a garden? To understand this case, the story had to go back years and cross the Channel to the quieter streets of Troyes in northeastern France. That was where Sophie grew up. She was born into a modest family and raised between her parents, Catherine de Vallon and Patrick Lyonnais, who later divorced. People who knew her remembered a shy girl with long brown hair, glasses, and a gentle presence. She loved animals, especially horses and pets, and she spent hours watching films, drawing, or playing video games. She did not look for the spotlight. She was the kind of teenager who preferred to help in the background. From a young age, she felt drawn to children. She helped look after younger relatives and neighbors' kids. Caring for them calmed her. It gave her a role that felt natural. As she grew older, teachers described her as quiet, kind, and a little naive. She avoided conflict and did her best to please the adults around her. When her parents separated, she tried to keep the peace, not adding to the tension at home. That instinct to keep others happy, to avoid problems, became part of her personality. When the time came to choose a path after school, Sophie turned toward childcare. She started training in early childhood education. Her ambitions were simple. She wanted a job where she could look after children, perhaps in a nursery or as a childminder. She did not dream of fame or big money. She wanted stability, a small place of her own one day, and work that matched her gentle character. But like many young Europeans, she also felt the pull of the wider world. Learning English mattered if she wanted more options. London, with its mix of cultures and opportunities, seemed like the perfect place to grow. Through contacts, she heard about a French woman living in London who needed help with her 2 young sons. The job was as an au pair, living with the family, doing childcare, basic housework, and improving her English at the same time. The woman spoke about working in fashion, about a stylish life in the city. From Troy, it sounded exciting, almost glamorous. After some exchanges, the job was offered. Sophie would move to London, live with this French couple, and look after the boys. It felt like a safe way to step into adult life. She would not be alone in a strange city. She would have a room, meals, and some pocket money. She told her mother she wanted to go. Her mother worried, as many mothers do, but she also wanted Sophie to have her own experiences. In early 2016, Sophie packed her suitcase and left Troy for London. At the beginning, things seemed to work. She cared for the children, learned the routines, and started to settle into the house in Southfields, near Wimbledon. Neighbors saw her walking with the boys to school and to the park. She smiled shyly when they greeted her. She kept in touch with home, sending messages about her new life, her English, and the city around her. But beneath the surface, the job was already more demanding than it looked. The hours were long. The pay was very low, around £50 a week, far from the proper minimum wage for the number of hours she worked. The couple expected a lot. Sophie rarely complained. She had been raised to make things work, to adapt, and she still hoped that London would open doors for her. As the months passed, though, something shifted in the house. The warm image of a stylish, modern family started to crack, and Sophie found herself caught inside a world that did not follow normal rules. The woman who hired Sophie was Sabrina Kouaida, a French woman of North African origin who had moved to London some years earlier. She presented herself as a fashion designer and stylist. She talked about celebrities and the entertainment world. Yet behind that facade, her life was unstable. Work came and went. Money problems appeared. Relationships with partners and friends often ended badly. People around her later described her as volatile, dramatic, and controlling. One of her previous relationships had been with Mark Walton, an Irish music executive and a founding member of the boy band Boyzone. The relationship ended years before Sophie ever met her. For most people, a breakup with an ex would become part of the past. For Sabrina, it became the center of a growing obsession. She accused him of betraying her, of abusing her, of following her life from a distance. Over the years, she made repeated complaints to the police about him. She posted allegations online. She claimed he was dangerous, powerful, and capable of extraordinary things. Her new partner, Wissem Medouni, seemed to come from a very different world. He was also French with Algerian roots, but he had studied economics and worked in finance in London as a credit risk analyst. Colleagues saw him as quiet, educated, and rational. When he moved in with Sabrina, he entered a chaotic emotional environment that slowly pulled him in. Over time, he stopped challenging Sabrina's beliefs and began to share them. Her fear of Mark Walton became his fear. Her anger became his anger. Psychiatrists later described a form of shared psychosis, where one partner's delusion spread to the other. Both of them came to believe that Walton was a powerful enemy who wanted to harm them and their children. By the time Sophie arrived in the house in Southfields, Sabrina and Wissem already carried this distorted world view. They saw threats everywhere. They believed people were spying on them, that their phones and lives were under attack. Instead of seeing their new nanny as a young woman who wanted to improve her English, they soon began to see her as a potential part of that imagined conspiracy. At first, the tension took the form of criticism and constant fault-finding. Sabrina complained about Sophie's work, her behavior, her supposed laziness. She put her down in front of others. Sophie, who hated conflict, tried to do better, to keep the peace. She accepted more tasks, longer hours, emotional pressure. It was what she had always done when adults were unhappy with her. Then the accusations changed. They became stranger and darker. Sabrina began to claim that Sophie was in contact with Mark Walton. She said the young au pair had been sent to spy on the family, to drug them, to harm the children. In Sabrina's mind, Sophie was no longer just an employee. She was an enemy inside the house. Wissem did not stop these ideas. He helped to feed them. Together, they started to question Sophie about calls, messages, and small details of her day. They asked her who she talked to, where she went, why she did simple things. They interpreted every normal action as a proof that she was hiding something. The line between reality and imagination disappeared for them. In the outside world, Sophie still seemed like an ordinary au pair. But inside the house, her life was shrinking. The couple controlled her movements. They took her passport and limited her access to her phone and social media. Friends noticed that she did not respond to messages anymore. Her family in France received fewer calls. When she did speak to them, she sounded tired and less hopeful. She told them there were problems at work and that she wanted to come home, but she did not speak openly about the full level of abuse she faced. Money became another tool of control. The couple stopped paying her regularly. Without savings or a ticket, she felt trapped in London. She did not have the language skills, confidence, or resources to leave and start somewhere else. She depended entirely on the people who were now turning against her. As the months passed, Sophie lost weight. Neighbors remembered seeing a thin young woman who looked exhausted and hungry. One neighbor sometimes gave her food. Others heard raised voices through the walls. Sometimes late at night, they heard one voice dominating, accusing, and another voice answering, soft and frightened. In rare moments, when Sophie escaped the house briefly, she appeared anxious and withdrawn, as if she carried secrets she did not know how to share. Inside, the psychological abuse turned into a kind of private interrogation regime. Sabrina and Wissem began to question Sophie for hours, demanding that she admit that she was an agent of Mark Walton. They told her that Walton controlled her, that he used black magic, that he ordered her to poison the family and abuse the children. They forced her to sit in front of a phone that recorded video and audio, while they attacked her with questions and accusations. In these recordings, later played in court, Sophie sounded broken and terrified. She tried to answer in her limited English, sometimes repeating what they wanted to hear in the hope that the questioning would stop. The couple took these forced statements as proof that their delusions were real. They replayed them, analyzed them, and went back to her with more questions. At the same time, the abuse turned physical. The post-mortem examination later showed that Sophie had suffered multiple broken ribs, a fractured sternum, a broken jaw, and extensive bruising in the days before her death. The injuries did not come from one single incident. They came from repeated blows and assaults over time. Prosecutors argued that Sabrina used objects like electrical cables to beat her, and that Wissem joined in or at least stood by while the violence happened. Sophie lived in constant fear. Every day she cared for the children and did her tasks, while every evening she faced the possibility of new interrogations, new insults, new attacks. She wrote messages and notes that showed her desperation, saying she wanted to leave and go home. But she did not know how to make that happen. In the small world of that house, the couple held all the power. She had no support, no safe place to go, and no clear way to escape. By mid-2017, Sophie was no longer an employee in a difficult job. She had effectively become a prisoner, dependent on the same people who tortured her. In September 2017, everything reached a deadly point. Exact details of the final hours remained uncertain because only Sabrina and Wissem knew exactly what happened, and each tried to blame the other. But witnesses and forensic evidence helped prosecutors build a likely sequence. One evening, a resident who stayed in the house heard shouting, banging, and the sound of water. The noises came from the bathroom. The witness heard Sophie screaming and then a final, heavy silence. According to the prosecution, the couple had cornered Sophie in the bath, beaten her again, and then either drowned her or caused fatal injuries that she could not survive. What is clear is that by the following day, Sophie was dead. Instead of calling an ambulance or the police, Sabrina and Huissem moved on to the next stage, covering up what they had done. They kept Sophie's death hidden for hours, maybe longer. During that time, they were still surrounded by the normal objects of daily life. The children were in the house. Food needed to be prepared. Ordinary routine sat side by side with the presence of a body that they needed to get rid of. On the 20th of September 2017, they carried her body into the garden. There, they built a makeshift bonfire. They added materials to fuel the flames, put Sophie's body on top, and set it alight. To hide the smell, they cooked chicken on a barbecue at the same time. The thick smoke drifted over neighboring gardens and into nearby houses. The smell of burning flesh, mixed with food and rubbish, was what finally pushed neighbors to call the emergency services. By the time firefighters arrived, Sophie's body had been burned almost beyond recognition. But the attempt to pretend that nothing had happened failed. The bonfire was too obvious, the smell too strong, and the lies too weak. The discovery of the remains in the ashes turned the house on Wimbledon Park Road into a crime scene, and the two people who had controlled Sophie's life were now at the center of a murder investigation. As detectives from the Metropolitan Police took over, they began by identifying the victim. The house belonged to a French couple with an au pair. That young woman had not been seen for some time. The remains in the garden, the personal items found in the ashes, and dental work made it possible to confirm that the victim was indeed Sophie Lyonnais. Officers questioned Sabrina and Huissem. Their stories shifted. At one point, Sabrina claimed that Sophie had left a day or two earlier to return to France. That was clearly impossible. Both of them eventually admitted burning the body, claiming they panicked after finding her dead. They insisted they had not murdered her. They said they had discovered her lifeless and decided to dispose of the body rather than face questions. The physical evidence told a different story. The pathologist documented the broken ribs, the crushed sternum, the broken jaw, and the pattern of bruises on Sophie's body. These injuries had occurred over days, not in one single accident. They showed a pattern of prolonged abuse, not an unexpected tragedy. Then investigators found the recordings. Stored on phones and devices were hours of audio and video from the interrogations. In them, Sabrina and Huissem cornered Sophie, accusing her again and again of working with Mark Walton. They pushed her to admit that he had used her to drug and abuse the family. They repeated bizarre theories about black magic and conspiracies. Sophie looked and sounded exhausted, frightened, and completely dominated. For the jury and for the public, these recordings later became one of the clearest windows into the nightmare she lived through in that house. Detectives also spoke to neighbors, friends, and Sophie's family. Neighbors described hearing shouting and seeing Sophie grow thinner. Some said they had tried to help with food or small acts of kindness. Friends and family in France showed messages from Sophie that described insults, unpaid wages, and her desire to come home. They had known she was unhappy, but they never imagined the level of violence behind the walls of that London home. Another key figure entered the case, Mark Walton himself. From Los Angeles, where he lived and worked as a music producer, he learned that he was at the center of the couple's accusations. He agreed to cooperate fully and flew to London to testify. In court, he gave evidence about his past relationship with Sabrina and denied all of the bizarre claims she had made against him. Investigators found no evidence that he had ever met Sophie or had any contact with her. For the jury, his calm testimony undercut the couple's fantasy that Sophie was part of a plot. By the time the case reached trial, prosecutors had built a picture of a young woman who had been targeted, isolated, and turned into a scapegoat for the fractured minds of two adults who lived inside a shared delusion. The trial took place at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, in 2018. Sabrina Kouida and Wissem Madouni both faced charges of murder and of perverting the course of justice. At the start of the proceedings, they admitted that they had burned Sophie's body and tried to dispose of it. They pleaded guilty to that part, but they both denied murder. Each tried to shift the blame onto the other, presenting themselves as less responsible, less violent, less in control. The prosecution laid out a different story. They said that Sabrina and Wissem had acted together, hand in hand, over many months. They described a pattern of emotional and physical abuse that started with criticism, escalated to interrogations, and ended with torture and death. They argued that the couple's obsession with Mark Walton had twisted their perception of reality so much that they turned an innocent young woman into the focus of their fear and rage. Jurors listened to the recordings of the interrogations. They heard the questions, the accusations, and Sophie's exhausted answers. They saw images of her injuries and heard expert testimony from doctors who explained how and when the bones in her body broke. They learned about the control over her passport, her phone, and her wages. They heard from neighbors who described the screams and the smell of burning flesh. They listened to Mark Walton explain the years of harassment he had received from Sabrina, and how her lies about him had become more extreme over time. Psychiatric experts spoke about the mental state of the defendants. Sabrina had a history of depression and signs of personality disorder. The pair showed features of shared psychosis, often called folie à deux, in which two people reinforce each other's delusions. But the experts also made something clear. Mental health problems did not remove responsibility for their actions. They still understood the difference between right and wrong. They planned the burning of the body. They lied to police. They did not act in a moment of confusion. They acted over time, with purpose. When it came to the central question, who actually killed Sophie in the bathroom, each defendant tried to point the finger at the other. Sabrina described herself as a victim of Wissem's control. He presented himself as a passive man, influenced and dominated by her. The prosecution argued that there was no need to choose one over the other. Both of them had taken part in the interrogations, the beatings, the starvation, and the attempt to destroy evidence. Both of them had built and strengthened the fantasy that Sophie worked for Mark Walton. After weeks of evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict. On 24 May 2018, they found both Sabrina Cuida and Wissem Madouni guilty of murder. At sentencing in June 2018, the judge faced two defendants who had turned an ordinary home into a private prison. He spoke about the cruelty of the abuse, the length of time it had lasted, and the way the couple had stripped Sophie of dignity and hope. He called their behavior an example of horrible cruelty that had no excuse. Sabrina Cuida and Wissem Madouni received life sentences with a minimum term of 30 years before they could even ask for parole. In court, Sophie's parents listened. Her mother, Catherine, and her father, Patrick, had traveled from France to sit through the trial and hear in painful detail what their daughter had suffered. They remembered a gentle, shy girl who loved children, horses, films, and simple pleasures. They had expected that one day she would start her own family. Instead, they now had to bury her. They spoke about nightmares, about the constant image of her suffering, and about the way their lives had broken when they learned that her body had been burned in a garden in London. Back in France, Sophie's funeral took place in a town near where she had grown up. Family, friends, and strangers came to pay their respects. In London, marches and vigils were held in her memory. Other au pairs began to speak publicly about their own experiences of exploitation and abuse. The case showed how easy it was for young live-in domestic workers to become invisible, hidden inside private homes where almost anything could happen without outside oversight. The story of Sophie Lyonnais did not end with the verdict. In the years that followed, documentaries, articles, and podcasts returned to her case. Journalists and writers explored the psychology of the couple who killed her, the legal process, and the wider question of how society protects, or fails to protect, those who work behind closed doors in other people's homes. The phrase shared psychosis appeared again and again in analysis of the case, as people tried to understand how two adults could feed each other's delusions to the point where they tortured and killed a young woman who had done nothing to them. For her family, none of that brought her back. Sophie remained the shy girl from Troy, who loved children and wanted a simple life. She had left home to learn English, to grow, and to take one small step into independence. Instead, she walked into the orbit of two people trapped in their own madness, and they turned her into the victim of a fantasy war that existed only in their heads. Today, when people remember the case of Sophie Lyonnais, they see both the horror of what she endured and the fragility of someone who was far from home, with limited language, little money, and a deep desire to trust the people who employed her. Her story warns about what can happen when power is unchecked behind the doors of a family house, when mental illness mixes with control and obsession, and when a kind and quiet person is treated as if their life has no value. In the end, the investigation, the trial, and the life sentences gave a measure of justice, but the true center of this story stayed the same. A 21-year-old French au pair, lost in a foreign city, whose only real crime was wanting to build a better future and placing her trust in the wrong people.